Welcome. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to London Archives. My name is Tom, and I'm an engaged. I can't speak. I'm an engaged learner here at the Archives. It's a pleasure to introduce expert on the air raids on London during the First. He's the author of a trilogy of books on the subject under the subtitle The Forgotten Blitz. We don't have books available for sale today, but there's information about the books on the back of the room. And for those who are joining us online, I'll try and find a link to pop into the chat for you as well. And Ian is also a recognised expert on the subject, and as a result of that has been made a fellow of the Royal Historical Society for his research on this area. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Ian, our speaker for this afternoon. So I'll just let you pop that on, Ian.
Thank you. Okay, right, well, thank you all very much for coming. Nice to see a few faces as well. As I like to say, everyone loves it. Right. As we've got a set time on this, I think we'll get started. In August 1914, at the outbreak of the First World War, Britain was well aware of the technical superiority in the air enjoyed by Germany's large, rigid airships, Zeppelins. For several years now, on.
Okay, let's fix that. 1 sec. So why is that happening? 2 secs. Probably in the wrong window.
Shall I?
Let's try again now.
Right. Yep.
Jolly good.
That's good. So that. For several years now, they had proved highly efficient in carrying thousands of excited pleasure seekers across Germany. And now, as conflict became a reality, Zeppelins were integrated into Germany's vast war machine. This weapon, its construction secrets carefully guarded, was unique to Germany and left other nations fearing the threat they posed far beyond Germany's borders. Yet initially, the German Kaiser Wilhelm II ruled against the bombing of Britain. As the month of April 1915 drew to a close and Londoners flipped the pages of their calendars to May, any early fears of aerial attack had largely evaporated. The war was 10 months old and monstrous airships had not sailed over the city like marauding pirate galleons of another era. Murderous salvos of explosive and flaming bombs had not been unleashed onto the crowded streets of the great metropolis. But although free from attack, London's appearance had changed in those 10 months. The war was real, its impact felt by every Londoner. When Britain declared war on Germany, the city had no defence against aerial attack. 4 days after the declaration, London received its first artillery allocated to an anti-aircraft role when 3 one-pounder pom-pom guns, named for the sound they made when firing, were installed to defend the city, or rather to defend Whitehall, at the Admiralty, the Foreign Office and the Crown Agent's buildings. No one in authority, however, thought they had the range to hit a Zeppelin, but it was hoped they would at least force them higher so the accuracy of bomb aiming would be affected. Otherwise, the very limited supply of guns for aerial defence were allocated to ports, docks, munition centres, oil depots and power stations. In October 1914, however, London finally received more effective artillery with 3-inch calibre guns being positioned on Tower Bridge and at Green Park, and 6-pounders at Waterloo, Nine Elms and the Temple. In addition, 5 more 1-pounder guns appeared at St James Street, Gresham College, Cannon Street Hotel, St Helens Court and Blackfriars. New searchlights appeared too. Then, in December 1914, after a lone German seaplane flew up the Thames estuary as far as Erith, the authorities responded by adding more 3-inch calibre guns, forming an outer defence at Clapton Orient Football Ground, Honor Oak and on Parliament Hill. The other obvious change to the city at this time was the blackout. The first attempt to instigate lighting restrictions proved largely ineffective. So on the 1st of October 1914, the Commissioner of Police issued a new order requiring all powerful outside lights to be extinguished, street lights to be extinguished or shaded, railway lighting reduced to a minimum, lights inside shops and other premises to be shaded, and that lights on buses and trams should just be sufficient for the collection of fares. The war, as one journalist observed, had ushered in a new dark age. He wrote, for the first time, Londoners knew what it was to be hampered a little by the darkness. They took it in the Londoners' way, good-humouredly, which is almost more than might have been expected, because the idea that his city would be scarcely yet penetrated the Londoner's easygoing mind, taking the whole thing as a not very good but tolerable joke. Another journalist described how the war had changed the London sky. All night long, the sky was being explored by two searchlights. One is stationed over the middle gate of the entrance to Hyde Park at Hyde Park Corner. Where the other is, I cannot say. They are very beautiful to watch as their brilliant lines of light, like gigantic flaming swords, cross one another, probing the skies, piercing to heights where our eyes cannot follow them. What seek they? Zeppelins. These words were written on the 31st of December 1914, while Londoners looked to the skies on that New Year's Eve, wondering when the Zeppelins would come. Unbeknown to them, they really hadn't been at risk at all. But that was all about to change. Despite Kaiser Wilhelm initially refusing permission for the start of the aerial bombardment of Britain, feeling like many that the war would soon be over, as the military increased pressure on him, he finally relented in January 1915, but insisted on the exclusion of London as a target due to his close ties to the British royal family and not wanting to be responsible for the destruction of London's important cultural heritage or historic monuments. The first Zeppelin raid took place on the 19th of January 1915 on Norfolk, with bombs falling mainly on Great Yarmouth and docks as a legitimate target. Then in May, he extended his approval to allow bombs east of the Tower of London. There were no great cathedrals or palaces in the East End. Had been reading about Zeppelin in their newspapers for almost 4 months, but it all seemed so far away and surprisingly ineffective. That first raid in Norfolk killed 4 and injured 16. But 2 raids that took place in April, striking northeast England and Essex, resulted in injuries to just 4 people. It was not the same in the British public, and in London it had a negligible effect on everyday life. The war, though, did make a very real impact on the city at the beginning of May 1915. On the 7th of May, a German U-boat sunk the Lusitania off the coast of Ireland. Anti-German rioting broke out in Liverpool, her home port, over the weekend of the 8th and 9th of May. Then, on the 10th of May, a Zeppelin bombed Southend-on-Sea, a popular seaside destination for Londoners. These incidents brought simmering anti-German feeling to the boil in London, and the next day rioting broke out in parts of the East End against businesses owned by Germans and Austrians, or indeed with a name that just sounded like it might be German. The mobs weren't fussy. As the unfortunate landlord of the Thatch House pub in Leytonstone discovered, when a mob smashed all his windows, forcing him to seek police protection. He was targeted because the mob thought his name sounded German. It was Strachan and he was Scottish. Then, on the 12th of May, these eruptions of hate spread like wildfire across the capital, from Tottenham in the north to Wandsworth in the south, but particularly in the East End. For those caught in the middle, it was a terrifying experience. As one newspaper put it, every man seemed to have given up the day to this anti-German orgy. Government sources estimated the damage caused by this outbreak of public disorder at £20,000. The next day, some level of normality returned to the streets of London, but more Zeppelin attacks took place on southeast England later that month. It seemed clear to those in authority that it was only a matter of time before the German raiders reached London. In Germany, the Army Airship Service took delivery of a new Zeppelin, LZ-38, at the beginning of April 1915. This was larger and more powerful than the previous models. With approval from the Kaiser to commence restricted bombing raids on London, the army prepared to make the first strike against the capital. Thus, LZ-38 had begun a gradual build-up prior to striking at the ultimate goal. On the 29th of April, LZ-38 attacked Ipswich. 10th of May, it bombed Southend, the raid that preceded the anti-German riots in London, followed on the 17th of May by a raid on Ramsgate, and then a return to Southend on the 26th of May. 5 days later, on the 31st of May 1915, 110 years ago this month, all was ready. The officer commanding LZ-38 was 35-year-old Erich Linnartz. He had served in the army since 1898 and transferred to the new airship service in 1912, eventually being given command of LZ-38. His forays against Southend and Ramsgate had taught him the best route and the positions of anti-aircraft guns near the coast. And he knew London too. In 1910, he had spent some time in the city. Throughout the morning of the 31st of May, there was great activity at the Zeppelin shed at Yver outside Brussels as the ground crew prepared LZ-38 for the raid. Engines were tested, ballast tanks checked, hydrogen topped up, and about 120 bombs carefully loaded. The majority, 90, were incendiary bombs. In total, they weighed about 1.5 tons. LZ-38, 536 feet long, which is about 179 yards, powered by 3 210 horsepower Maybach engines, capable of driving her forward, wind permitting, at around 50 miles an hour, was now ready. The ground crew hauled her from her shed, holding her down with ropes. Once clear, the propellers were tested, swirling up blinding clouds of dust. Then the order was given to the ground crew to let go the ropes, allowing LZ-38 to rise majestically in the late afternoon sunshine. As LZ-38 climbed into the Belgian sky and left Yver behind, her commander, Linnartz, later recalled, "It was a beautiful night, a night of star-spangled skies and gentle breezes, a night hard to reconcile with a purpose as grim as ours." LZ-38 appeared over Margate at around 9:45 p.m. As it did so, an anti-aircraft gun opened fire. Linnartz dramatically described how the guns spat viciously and how the crew heard shells scream. In fact, below only fired 2 rounds, but it was enough to increase his altitude and speed. Approaching the Essex coast, LZ-38 came inland north of Shoebury-Ness and skirted Southend. It was familiar territory after his previous raids. As he crossed Essex, the sound of engine noise was reported over Wickford at 10:40 p.m. and at Brentwood about 5 minutes later. The great expanse of London lay just 20 minutes away. In London, the 31st of May had been like any other ordinary Monday. In Stoke Newington, Albert Lovell, a 39-year-old clerk, had spent a pleasant evening at home in Alcombe Road with his wife Eleanor and 2 friends who had come to stay. The guests retired to bed at 10:30, sharing a room at the top of the house. Shortly afterwards, Albert Lovell popped out to post a letter. The moon was rising and full, the weather fine, and just a light wind blew. Less than a mile to the south, Samuel Leggett, a 38-year-old deliveryman, was at home in Cooper Road. He and his wife occupied rooms on the first floor of number 33. At 10:45 p.m, Samuel was in the armchair reading the newspaper and chatting to his wife Elizabeth, who was in bed in the same room. Their 5 children, including the eldest, Elizabeth May, aged 11, and 3-year-old Elsie, the youngest, were asleep in the adjoining room. Another half-mile on, Henry Good, a 49-year-old pepper grinder by trade, was at home with his wife Caroline. They rented 3 4 rooms on the first floor of a 3-storied house at 187 Bulls Pond Road. Sarah Coningsby, a 53-year-old widowed charwoman, occupied the other room on the same floor at the front of the house. The owner of the property, Thomas Sharpling, a builder, lived on the ground floor with his family. Mr. and Mrs. Good's recently married son, also called Henry, had visited his parents earlier in the evening, but now they were preparing for bed. Police stations all across North and East London had their routines broken at 10:55 p.m. when the shrill ring of the telephone brought the long-feared news. Aircraft raid impending. But no public raid warning followed. London didn't have one in place for another 2 years. 5 minutes later, Sub-Inspector Locking of the Special Constabulary could not believe his eyes when the unmistakable cigar shape of a Zeppelin appeared high in the sky over Stoke Newington station. Linnartz and Zeppelin LZ-38 had arrived over the capital. Linnartz continues his account. The quivering altimeter showed that our height was 10,000 feet, almost 2 miles high. The air was keen and we buttoned our jackets as we prepared to deal the first blow. My finger hovered on the button that electrically operated the bombing apparatus. Then I pressed it. We waited. Minutes seemed to pass before, above the humming song of the engines, there rose a shattering roar. In fact, the first missile released by Linnartz was an incendiary bomb. These did not explode, but burst into flames and burnt at a searingly high temperature. They were designed to smash through roof tiles and set fire to joists, while burning petrol dripped through floorboards to start fires on the floors below. That first incendiary the roof of Albert Lovell's house at 16 Malcolm Road in Stoke Newington. Lovell had just returned from posting his letter when screams filled the house. The bomb had set fire to the room occupied by his guests. He bounded up the stairs, but the door was locked and the key on the inside had fallen to the floor in the confusion, smoke and fumes that now filled the room. Undaunted, Lovell broke down the door and rescued the 2 ladies who, coughing and spluttering, fled from the house in their dressing gowns. Then together, Mr. and Mrs. Lovell led their children to safety at a neighbour's. His family, Lovell turned his attention to saving his home. With no telephone, he grabbed his son's bicycle from the hallway and cycled hard, calling out, "Fire! Fire!" all the way to the fire station in Brook Road. The fire was successfully extinguished, damage limited to the upper floor of the house. With his first incendiary bomb burning, Linnartz directed LZ-38 across Stoke Newington High Street and released an explosive bomb. It landed in the garden of 15 Lavers Road, but failed to detonate. As this was London's very first, there were many safety lessons when it came with was a The residents of Chisholm Road, Dinaver Road, Neville Road and Allen Road were next to find themselves in the firing line. One bomb exploded to the rear of houses in Dinaver Road, tearing off the backs of 43 and 45, and also caused damage to number 41, the home of Police Inspector Herbert Wells. Amy Grant, living at number 45, suffered severe shock and had her right arm fractured by falling debris. Her brother Percy carried her to a doctor. In Neville Road, an incendiary bomb landed on a former coach house at the back of the Neville Arms pub, but proved to be another dud, causing only minor damage. 2 doors away from the Neville Arms, however, an incendiary struck number 27, causing a serious fire which gutted 5 rooms of the house occupied by George West, a night watchman, and his family. West's 26-year-old son, Alfred, suffered burns to his face, but the police dealt with the blaze before the fire brigade arrived. The noise of the bombs had brought people out into the street. While some rushed to help neighbours, others just looked on, too shocked to think more. No one saw the Zeppelin pass over them, 2 miles up in the sky. No searchlights pierced the darkness. No anti-aircraft guns barked their defiance. A small grenade-type bomb exploded at 102 Shakespeare Road, striking the coping, after which it fell to the front area, carrying away the steps and damaging a side wall and railings. The bomb also caused damage to the house next door, where flying debris inflicted minor injuries on the occupier, Charles Pollington, and his 6-year-old daughter, Violet. Although about 8 bombs had fallen so far, injuries had been light. But that was about to change as LZ-38 passed over Cooper Road. On the first floor of number 33, Samuel Leggett, as we saw earlier, was with his wife, while their 5 children were asleep in the back bedroom. Moments after 11 p.m, the couple heard explosions. Concerned, Samuel went to the children's bedroom, but as he opened the door, an incendiary bomb smashed through the ceiling, having passed through the room above on the 2nd floor, occupied by Rose Clark and her little niece, known to everyone as Curly. Smoke and flames quickly filled the room as Mr. Leggett bravely battled to save his children, while Mrs. Leggett ran out into the street in a nightdress, screaming for help. A neighbour, a Mr. Smith, recalled hearing a terrible rushing of wind and a shout of fire. More chilling, "The Germans are here!" Battling the flames and suffering serious burns to his hands and face, Samuel Leggett dragged his children, all also suffering burns, from their bedroom inferno, which moments before had been a peaceful haven. But Samuel wasn't finished. He dashed up to the top of the house and rescued little Curly too. Amidst the confusion, neighbours crowded around to help. For a moment, Mr. and Mrs. Leggett looked around at 3-year-old Elsie, but someone, meaning well, said safety. Traumatised by the whole experience, the Leggetts took themselves to the Metropolitan Hospital in Kingsland Road, neighbour carrying 11-year-old Elizabeth May, who had suffered serious burns. Sadly for the Leggetts, the trauma of the night wasn't over. At about 4 a.m, a policeman entered the Leggetts' burnt-out home and discovered that little Elsie hadn't been carried to safety. In the smoke-blackened bedroom, he found her little child body buried beneath the still smouldering debris. And yet there was still more dreadful news to come for the distraught family. A few days later, their eldest daughter, Elizabeth May, died in hospital from those terrible burns. Distanced from the personal horrors his bombs were causing, Linnets continued southwards, dropping bombs across the Mildmay Park area of Dalston, where they caused a few minor injuries and slight damage to property. But the fire brigade was quickly in attendance, dealing with the fires that broke out. But the next tragedy was just seconds away. At 187 Balls Pond Road, Henry Good Jr., who had visited his parents, Henry and Caroline Good, had left them at about 9:30 p.m. Shortly after 11, 22-year-old Henry Jr. awoke to the shocking sound of explosions. From his front door, he saw flames in the night sky from the direction of his parents' home. He quickly and rushed to the scene. 2 bombs had crashed down through the house to the basement, setting fire to the staircase, which now burnt furiously. On the ground floor, Thomas Sharpling heard a bang, saw smoke, and quickly roused his wife, son and 3 daughters and got them out of the house. Unable to use the burning stairs, he ran to the back of the building and shouted up to Mr. Good. Getting no answer, he grabbed a brick and threw it through the window. As there was still no response, Sharpling concluded that Mr. and Mrs. Good must be out. Henry Good now reached his parents' home. He pushed through the crowd that had gathered and into the back garden next door, from where he could see the broken window. A fireman assured him that the occupants of the house were safe, as indeed the Sharplings were. Henry then went to his grandparents' home to see if his parents had sought refuge there, but there was no sign of them. Police Constable Barnett was standing nearby when the bomb struck the house on Balls Pond Road. He reported hearing the Zeppelin's engines, seeing a bomb drop, and then the house burst into flames. A woman then appeared at a front window pleading for help. It was Sarah Conningham's room on the same floor as the Goods. The policeman grabbed a ladder. Due to the intensity, he was unable. Instead, he secured a blanket and with the help of others held it out to jump to safety. Only around midnight was the whereabouts of Henry and Caroline Good finally revealed. With the flames extinguished, Constable Barnett placed a ladder against the house again and peered into the blackened smoking room at the back. There, sitting by the bed, were two figures, as if in prayer. But they weren't in prayer. They were dead. Henry and Caroline Good were naked, their clothes burnt from their bodies. All that remained was a small band of a woolen jumper on Henry's arm. That arm was tenderly around his wife's waist. The flames had burnt all the hair from Henry's body, while Caroline gripped a large piece of her own hair in her hand. The doctor who attended the scene gave evidence at the inquest and agreed that she had probably snatched at her own hair in her dying agony. The doctor pronounced death due to suffocation and burns. But how tragic their last moments must have been. Unable to escape the fiercely burning building, the couple, married for 27 years, knelt down together by the bed and died in each other's arms. Linnets and LZ-38 now followed the line of Southgate Road. 8 or 9 bombs fell there, but they caused only minor damage. The shock, however, was great. One resident, Mr. Cook, later recalled, "A terrific explosion startled us just outside my house. People flung up their windows and saw an astonishing sight. The roadway, a mass of flames from the incendiary bombs. Flames reached a height of 20 feet. A policeman ran up, his helmet in his hand. 'Get inside,' he shouted. 'They're here.' Then people realised what was happening. The shock that people were experiencing had tragic results nearby. In Southgate Grove, the sound of exploding bombs reached Eleanor Willis, a fragile 67-year-old spinster living at number 8. She became seriously ill. 3 days later, she died. At her inquest, the jury returned the verdict. Death was due to shock following bombs dropped from hostile aircraft. Over Hoxton now, LZ-38 continued dropping bombs. In his account, Linnutz described his view. One by one, the bombs moaned and burst. Flames sprung up like serpents goaded to attack. Taking one of the biggest fires, I was able by it to estimate my speed and drift. That biggest fire may well have been one that engulfed a cabinet maker's premises at 31 Ivy Street. Or maybe it was at 5 Bacchus Walk, where flames consumed the premises of another cabinet maker as well as that of a toy company. And between those two conflagrations stood the house of Herman Morris, a tailor living at 49 Ivy Lane. An incendiary bomb smashed through the roof and set fire to the house, where only the prompt actions of a neighbour saved Morris's 2 young daughters. Fires were burning all over Hoxton now. At 329 Hoxton Street, a furniture manufacturer's yard was ablaze. The night watchman, Peter Begovich, a 44-year-old Russian, fled in terror from the flames. Unfortunately for him, he ran straight into an angry crowd. They accused him of being a German and of starting the fire. Then, in the formal words of a police report, he was ill-treated by the crowd, which resulted in him needing medical attention later for 8 cuts to his head. But for Hoxton now, the worst was over. Away to the southeast, Shoreditch was busy that Monday night. Its music halls were doing a good trade. And in Whitechapel, Greenberg's Pavilion, a popular picture house, would soon be emptying its customers into the commercial road. Nearby, Isaac Lehrman, a Russian Jewish tailor, and his wife Rachel were waiting for the return of their 16-year-old daughter Leah, who had gone to Greenberg's with a friend. A street away, another tailor, Louis Rubin, and his wife Sarah were growing increasingly concerned by the late return home of their 8-year-old son Samuel, who had also gone to Greenberg's. Having passed over Hoxton, Linnets continued his trail of destruction. His next salvo of bombs descended around Shoreditch High Road. 3 incendiaries landed on the roof of the Shoreditch Empire Music Hall, where a performance was still in progress. A large hole in the roof and damaging the ceiling above the stage and a dressing room. As plaster rained down, only the swift actions of the manager, who addressed the audience from the stage, prevented a panic. Other bombs fell close by. 3 smashed through the glazed roof of the vast railway goods yard at Bishopsgate. Only minor damage. From his position over Shoreditch, it would have been simple now for Linnets to strike at the heart of the City of London. As he wrote, "There were the old familiar landmarks, St. Paul's, the Houses of Parliament and Buckingham Palace, dreaming in the light of the moon which had now risen." But the Kaiser's orders were specific. Bombing was confined to the area east of the Tower of London. So LZ-38 steered away from the city. The unfortunate residents of Whitechapel would suffer instead. Several bombs fell across Spitalfields, causing little damage. Then over Whitechapel, the first 3 bombs there struck at the core beliefs of many. A churchyard, a synagogue, and a bonded warehouse full of Johnny Walker's whiskey. At about 11:15 p.m, the audience had already emerged from Greenberg's picture house out onto the commercial road and were dispersing. But as so, the night sky filled with an extraordinary sound: exploding bombs. Looking back towards Shoreditch, the sky glowed an eerie red. Amongst the crowd were Leah Lehrman and her friend. Also in the crowd was 8-year-old Samuel Rubin, whose parents were worrying about his late return. All 3 were only a few minutes from their homes. As the bombs began to fall in Commercial Road, everyone ran for cover. In the turmoil, Leah Lehrman and her friend lost each other. Both Leah and Samuel Rubin ran into Christian Street. As they did so, a bomb exploded. A policeman standing about 200 yards away ran to the spot and was joined by a colleague. There they found Samuel Rubin slumped in a doorway, a pool of blood already spreading inexorably around him. He was dead. They found Leah too. She had grievous injuries, wounds to her neck, face, a deep lacerated wound to her right breast, and injuries to her elbow and thigh. But she was alive, just. 11 others in the street, bewildered and shocked, bore terrible injuries. Now, desperately worried about the absence of his son, Samuel's father, Louis, went out to search for him. He heard that a boy had been injured and taken to the London hospital. There he found Samuel, lying dead on a stretcher. As was stated at the inquest, wounds to his abdomen, metal fragments in his shoulder, and other injuries to his legs and hands. The police report, however, was more candid. Young Samuel had been disemboweled. Leah's parents were also searching for their daughter. They eventually found her in the hospital in the early hours of the morning. Her mother described her as unconscious and hurt all over. Leah never recovered and died a few hours later. Those 2 marked the last fatalities of the raid. But LZ-38 still had more bombs to drop. After an explosive bomb dropped on Burslem Street, LZ-38 steered back across the commercial road, taking a northeast course, having come within 500 yards of the London docks. 6 bombs fell across Stepney, but none of these caused any personal injury or significant damage. Linnets was now on his way home. He'd still not come under attack, but did not wish to tempt fate. As he steered out towards Leytonstone, he readied his last 6 bombs. The first of these fell on 26 Colgrave Road, Stratford. On the ground floor lived 42-year-old warehouseman John Stacey, his wife Mary and their 2 sons. Upstairs lived 60-year-old Peter Gillies, a carpenter at a nearby brewery, and his wife Emma. A neighbour, Herbert Osborne, told the police, "I heard the droning of an aeroplane. I could not see anything. According to the noise, it came lower and then I saw the bomb drop. It was simply a dark object and I saw it drop through the roof of number 26. The bomb, an incendiary, crashed through the roof and passed about 5 feet from Peter and Emma Gillies as they lay in bed. It smashed right through a wooden chair in the room, through the floorboards, down to the hallway on the ground floor, where smoke and fumes filled the air as flames caught the floor and wallpaper. John Stacey immediately leapt out of bed and unsuccessfully attempted to extinguish the flames, helped by a neighbour. Eventually, Stacey managed to throw the still burning bomb out into the road, from where a policeman put it in a bucket of water and carried it, hissing and spitting, to West Ham Police Station. Linnets dropped his final salvo on Leytonstone, all falling west of Leytonstone High Road in Florence Road, Park Grove Road, Granley Road and Dyers Hall Road. Most of the damage was minor and only 2 people, Rebecca Green and Thomas Gilbert, suffered slight injuries. The very last bomb of this first London air raid landed on 46 Philibrook Road, the home of Albert Fisher. It damaged the roof, ceiling and front and back bedrooms. But by the time Mr. Fisher realised what was happening, LZ-38 was gone. The first London air raid, which started in Stoke Newington and ended in Leytonstone, and which had lasted less than 30 minutes, was over. Although the anti-aircraft guns in London stayed silent, the defences had one last defiant gesture to make. Hartman Linnets' account shows this did cause some concern. We could see ahead of us the sea, through which the moon had laid a silver path to guide us home. As we crossed the black ridge of the shore, we were met with a further attack from the anti-aircraft guns at Burnham and Southminster. Shell after shell whizzed past, some burst dangerously near. On we flew, and at last we were out of range and the firing died down. Those mobile 1-pounder guns at Burnham fired off 179 rounds, and the gun at Southminster 20 more, but all without success. The aircraft defending London that night fared little better. In all, 15 were in the sky, flying from Chingford, Dover, Eastchurch, Hendon, Rochford and Westgate. But at least 2 of the 15 only took off after LZ-38 had departed, and only 1 pilot actually saw the raider, but his engine failed, forcing him to crash land in the mud at Leigh-on-Sea. He survived without injury. Another pilot that night, however, was not so fortunate. With a Sopwith gun bus, the only serviceable aircraft available at Hendon, it was taken up by Flight Lieutenant Douglas Barnes as pilot, with Flight Sub-Lieutenant Ben Travers acting as his observer gunner. Barnes and Travers didn't take off until after LZ-38 had already turned for home, and once airborne they soon became disorientated, leading to an emergency landing at Theobald's Park in Hertfordshire. As they descended through a belt of ground fog, something told Travers to unfasten his seatbelt, a potentially foolish thing to do. The aeroplane hit the ground hard at high speed, bounced twice and then turned over on its back. The first impact jettisoned the unsecured Travers clear of the aircraft, but Douglas Barnes died in the wreckage. Ben Travers recovered from his injuries, returned to flying, and later went on to become an extremely successful playwright and novelist. Back in London, the police reported positively on their night's work. All police areas echoed the sentiments in the report issued by H Division, which covered the area from Shoreditch to Stepney. It stated, "A considerable number of persons quickly assembled in the streets, particularly at Shoreditch High Street, Whitechapel Road, Commercial Road and Christian Street, but they were generally amenable to police and exceedingly well behaved. There was no panic or disorder." However, this lack of disorder by the crowds may have been in part due to the sheer numbers of police, both regulars and specials, on the streets. H Division had called out 475 officers, while at K Division, where only 2 bombs dropped, an immense army of 955 police and specials assembled, ready to react to the slightest trouble. The following day, when the police presence was less evident, the mood of the crowd changed. Sylvia Pankhurst, a champion for women's welfare in the East End at the time, had been close to bombing. In the morning after the raid, vast numbers of sightseers descended on the stricken areas, keen to see the damage for themselves. Of those who appeared, she wrote, "Streams of people led the way to the buildings. Crowds, mostly made up of women, gathered before each ruined home. One, where a child had been killed, was still inhabited. A soldier in khaki stood at the door, striving in vain to keep back the press of human bodies surging against it. In the ashes left by the fires which had ravaged homes, nothing save the twisted ironwork of the bedsteads could be identified." In this environment, rumours spread quickly. Many claimed to have seen lights signalling to the Zeppelin raider. It was time to make the Germans still in their midst pay. The Times newspaper gave a brief report on damage to property, but Sylvia Pankhurst, who witnessed some of this disorder at close hand, gave a far more personal view of this terror on the London streets. Down the street, a babel of shouting, tremendous outcry. A couple of lads on bicycles leading, a swarm of children on the fringes screaming like gulls. Missiles were flying. In the centre of the turmoil, men dragged a big, stout man, stumbling and resisting in their grasp. His clothes whitened by flour, his mouth dripping blood. They rushed him on. New throngs closed around him. There was more shouting, a woman's scream. The tail of the crowd dashed off towards the sound. Crowds raced to it from all directions, fierce, angry shouts and yells. A woman was in the midst of a struggling mob, her blouse half torn off, her fair hair fallen, her face contorted with pain and terror, blood running down her bare white arm. A big drunken man flung her to the ground. She was lost to sight. "Oh my God, oh, they are kicking her," a woman screamed. Pankhurst pleaded with a soldier standing nearby to intervene, but he just replied, "What should I?" Then a military car drew up and she asked the officer inside if he would take the woman away. "I don't think we can," he answered. "We are on military business." Pankhurst then describes how the mood of the mob changed, its anger seemingly satiated. Pitying hands now picked up the woman who had fainted and supported her, while someone attempted to tidy her hair. Those people who moments before had been shrieking their anger were now standing silent and awed. Finally, the police arrived and heavy-handedly dispersed both the crowd and the victim. A calm finally settled over the city. London had been subjected to assault from the air for the very first time, but the fears of uncontrollable fires, mass death and panic on the streets had not materialised. Although LZ-38 had flown unmolested to the capital, and the fire reported 41 fires, only one of these was considered serious and required a district call-out, the majority being dealt with by local appliances, the police and the public. LZ-38's raid had caused 7 civilian deaths and injured 35, with material damage estimated at a little under £19,000, which was in fact just less than the cost of the damage caused in those first anti-German riots 3 weeks earlier. One immediate effect of the raid was the positioning of 3 more anti-aircraft guns at Blackheath, Finsbury Park and West Ham, filling gaps in the outer defence line. This was the start of a steady stream of improvements to London's air defences. The Kaiser authorised the whole of London as a target in July 1915, with German airships bombing the capital on 8 more occasions. But as London's defences continued to evolve and new weapons became available, by the end of 1916, Germany no longer considered London a viable target for its airships. While Zeppelins continued to attack the Midlands and north of England, from the summer of 1917, Germany handed the task of striking against London to a long-range bomber aircraft, the Gotha and the Riesenflugzeug, or giant aeroplane. In the meantime, however, London had faced up to the Zeppelin menace for the first time and emerged unbowed. And what of the Londoners' experience? For those unfortunate enough to find themselves in the path of the Zeppelin raiders, their experience was one of terror and fear. But for those looking on from afar, the sight of one of these gaseous monsters, as Winston Churchill once dubbed them, shining silver in a dark night sky when caught by a sweeping searchlight, held a terrible fascination, one that still holds true to this day. They could inspire both an unworldly fear and dread, but also awe and fascination in equal measure, and created enduring, never to be forgotten memories. Back in Germany, the crew of LZ-38 were enthusiastically welcomed home as heroes. The German newspapers extracted every ounce of bombastic rhetoric they could muster to celebrate this occasion. Captured this mood. At last, the long yearned for punishment has fallen on England. In that moment when our airship heroes saw London breaking up in smoke and fire, they lived 1,000 lives of immeasurable joy, which all who remain at home must envy them. Back in Britain, these same men, so lauded in Germany, simply became known as the baby killers. Thank you all very much indeed. I'm happy to take any questions, or if anyone needs to escape, now's a good time to do it. Yes?
Yes, I've got 2 points really.
Yeah.
First of all, develop the Zeppelins. What was Britain doing about air capability?
Yep.
Second thing is, what was the purpose of the Zeppelin raid? Was it just to inspire fear? Because it doesn't seem to have much strategic point.
Yeah, absolutely. So we were very fearful of the threat posed by the Zeppelins. Didn't know how they were constructed, how they were built. So the Admiral did in 1911 to try and build a Zeppelin of its own. They worked with Vickers up in Barrow, and they built the Zeppelin. It was dragged out of its shed one day, tested, went back in the shed, and it stayed in 4 months. And the crew christened it the Mayfly because they thought it may fly or maybe it won't. In fact, it didn't fly because the next time they went out, it got caught and broke in 2 and was completely scrapped. So we gave up trying to build a Zeppelin-type airship of our own, so we didn't understand what we were getting into. Your second question, what was the purpose? The Zeppelin really is a terror weapon. Bomb aiming in the Second World War was pretty random. In the First World War, you're only just learning how to fly. Aviation is in absolute infancy. And so the idea was that if you could just get somewhere like London, it's a big city. If you drop your bombs, you're going to hit London and you're going to cause terror and you're going to cause fear. And nobody knew at that stage, so early in the war, how will civilians react to have bombs dropped on them from the air. It's something that had never happened before. And so the Germany genuinely believed that if you dropped bombs consistently enough on a city like London, the public would be moved to panic and they would demand that the government sue for peace. As we now know, that aerial bombing doesn't have that effect. It didn't have that effect in 1940. In modern wars now, there is still aerial bombing, but it's not crushing people's resistance. So yes, it was really going to be a terror weapon because bomb aiming accuracy was very, very poor. Yeah.
There was documentation, there is documentation from Germany saying that the strategy was to induce fear in
there was
the population here.
In the naval service, Germany had two separate Zeppelin fleets. The Army had one and the Navy had one. And a very senior guy in the Admiralty stated that he doubted any population could stand having bombs, civilian population could stand having bombs dropped on it from the air. And they generally believed that that was be the case.
And the Zeppelin that you said was called the Mayflower, that was funded by your government, by the government?
Yeah, absolutely. Government funded. The Admiralty and Vickers Engineering took on the process of building it in 1911.
And did you do research to find, was it the case that the Admiralty or your government knew that the Germans were continuing to perfect their Zeppelin?
Yes.
And the British government decided to not do anything after the Mayflower?
Not of that type. When once the war started, we revisited it, and we started looking at building again rigid airships. Every time a Zeppelin was shot down in France or something, people inspected the remains and they said, okay, so that goes like that goes like that. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. Maybe we could build that. And so every time we built a Zeppelin, we were far behind the stage in Germany because they were constantly evolving through the war, getting to a greater level of perfection each time. By the late 1918, so the war, probably halfway through 1918, the war was getting very much to an end. We did have a couple of rigid airships flying on coastal patrol. We realised there was no point to bomb Germany because they realised they were being shot down over the UK now because Britain eventually worked out how to shoot them down with developing new ammunition. So they used them as coastal patrol, looking for U-boats and scouting for the fleet. But that we never used them overseas in a bombing role. At the back first, yep.
How many Zeppelins were in the fleet during this attack, and how many were in the fleet at the end of the war?
So this was a single Zeppelin attack. Early raids, I'd say most, they were still finding their feet, and they'd also generally stick close to the coast. As the war progressed, the large September 1916, there were 4 from the Army and 12 from the Navy. That was the night that our shot down the first one. And that made, after that, the Army took less interest in overseas raiding. They concentrated more on the Eastern Front with their Zeppelins. But the Navy Zeppelins kept pushing on, kept coming. In 1915, there were 20 Zeppelin raids on Britain. In 1916, there were 22 Zeppelin raids. But after that, the first airship was shot down, then 2 more were shot down, brought down towards the end of the month, and then 2 more the month after that. Raiding was seriously cut back, and in 1917 there were only 6 Zeppelin raids, and in 1918 only 3 Zeppelin raids. But by 1917 that is being taken up by the German bomber aeroplanes now, who are, they don't have the range of the Zeppelins. London is the limit, so all their attacks are taking place against East England and the maximum point. Yeah, I mean, Zeppelin development, there were probably about, from the beginning of the war to the end of the war, there were probably about 100 Zeppelins built, but they're constantly being refurbished. The than about 20 active at any one time. And so
You say the Zeppelin was flying at about 2 miles high. When the aircraft was scrambled, how high could they? They couldn't fly that.
It's a very good question. No. The aircraft in 1915, the quality of, in May 1915, the quality of aircraft allocated to home defence was pretty poor. And no, you're quite right. They would have struggled to get to 10,000 feet. But you know, a Zeppelin, when it first approached the coast, the British coast, it was probably flying less than 10,000 feet. So they had a chance then. But once bombs, we've got 1.5 tons of bombs. Once you release that, you're 1.5 tons lighter. And so on the way out, it's sort of 10,000 plus. And yeah, the aeroplanes with no chance. I mean, you know, the Sopwith gun bust that came up there, that was really going to struggle. But there were just no other aircraft available. Because there had never been an attack on London at that stage, the attitude defence was pretty lax, to be honest with you. Officially, defence should have been in the hands of the Flying Corps, the Army's Air Force. But when war started, the only they had to go to France with the British Expeditionary Force. And so the Admiralty, Winston Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty, he said, OK, the Admiralty will take on home defence, aerial home defence. And they had a complete mix-mash of aircraft, seaplanes, land planes, different quality, enterprising pilots, but it was a temporary arrangement, and so no in-depth aerial defence system was developed by the Admiralty in 1915. So it's very much, in 1915, the Zeppelins really did have it their own way. They could go where they want, do what they wanted, and there was very little they could do about it. In 1916, responsibility for home defence transferred to the Army or Flying Corps, and things start a whole lot more organised, and they develop a proper defence, patrol lines and things, and pick up. And all they needed then was better weapons with which to engage the airships, and they got those by the summer of 1916. And they're first coming to action in that raid of the 2nd and 3rd of September, that large raid, and that's when the first airship is not a Zeppelin down. There were not all airships are Zeppelins. We call all vacuum cleaners Hoovers. We call all airships Zeppelins, but there was a rival firm to Zeppelin called Schutter-Lance. The difference being that Zeppelins had a framework of metal, Schutter-Lance had a framework of wood, and it was a Schutter-Lance that was in that large raid, and that was the first aircraft to come down. But then, as I said, 2 Zeppelins were brought down at the end of that month, and another one the week after that, and 2 more Zeppelins in November. And really, that changes everything then.
Thank you.
Yes, at the back.
Yeah, thank you. Great presentation.
Thank you.
You mentioned that as the ships approached the English coast, they were flying fairly low. What's your view on why English defences or British defences didn't suss that out and shoot more as the waves progressed? Because there were many waves.
So are we talking about this raid in particular, or generally?
Generally, I think.
Generally, yeah.
Once we knew that Germans were sending Zeppelins, why didn't Britain put more defences on the sea, at the coast, as they were flying low, to catch them there?
Yeah. So initially, you've got to know that they're coming. We did have some light ships out in the mouth of the Thames and off the east. They start being employed as observation posts in 1916 because they were linked by telephone to land. They were permanently moored ships, and they had telephone links. But before that, really, it was only when an airship was visible from the coast that anyone knew it was coming. They knew there was a raid. There was an interesting situation at the beginning of the war that quite quickly, we had listening stations all around the East Coast, radio, wireless listening stations, and they soon discovered that every time a Zeppelin left its home base, it gave a radio message that was very simple. It said, "Only HVB on board." And they worked out what that meant was that it was a signal that they were only taking a common code book that they knew was already compromised. They weren't carrying top secret code books, which they didn't want to lose. And they soon realized that when they heard the only HVB signal, it meant they were coming to England. So they knew when they were leaving Germany, but they didn't know where on the coast of England they were coming. So they knew there was a raid, and so people on the coast were watching. But it's only really when they start coming in visual distance, or if they are sending out more messages from the Zeppelin, that we get closer position. We can, by triangulation, we can pinpoint them. The other aspect is that certainly initially for right through 1915, the guns on the coast were pretty poor quality. Mainly these 1-pounder guns, these 1-pounder pom-poms that we're talking about, that just didn't have the range or the shells they fired. They believed that after the war, someone wrote a thesis about them. And the shells the 1-pounder were firing wouldn't detonate on airship fabric. So it would go straight through and out the other side unless it hit something, hit part of the metal framework. So even if one was low enough to get hit by a 1-pounder shell, the chances are it wasn't going to do any damage. So they made a lot of noise, they put up a lot of shells, but they weren't really threatening. And then once they came inland, then there would be, I should also add that throughout the war, we get lots and lots of new developments in Zeppelins. Zeppelins are continually being developed to fly higher, because that's the best defence. They know that Britain's aeroplanes are not particularly able to climb up to great heights. So they learn that if we can reduce the weight of a Zeppelin by cutting out different aspects of it, reducing engines, yes, we go slower, but if we're higher, they can't get us anyway, so it doesn't matter. So by the end of the war, so this raid, he does 10,000 feet. By the end of the war, they were doing 20,000 feet. So it's in the substratosphere at that point. They're flying in minus 20 degrees temperature, having to have oxygen, frostbite. Crews come back with frostbite. You know, it's an extraordinary experience. There's no heating on a Zeppelin, and so yeah, it's a battle of arms. Zeppelins go higher, we get better aeroplanes, go higher again. That battle all like that. So it was actually, you know, it was hard to shoot down, to find and shoot down a Zeppelin. You know, in the black sky, although Zeppelins may have that rate of 16, there's 16 Zeppelins, they're not flying together. They're not a big pack of Zeppelins. They're taking off from different bases all over Germany and Belgium, and their target is England. They're not trying to do a 10 squadron raid altogether, because number one, they don't want to get in each other's way, and if one's above the other, it might drop bombs on it. So they tend to work individually once they've left Germany. So yeah, it's a hard thing to find them. It's a hard thing to shoot them down. But eventually, from 1916 on, we developed a method to do that.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yes, that brings the point on to the British developing incendiary bullets.
Yes.
And was it a pilot called Lee Robinson that actually shot down the first Zeppelin?
Yep. So science. Hydrogen, as we all know, is a highly footages of the Hindenburg going down in Lakehurst, New Jersey, a huge ball of fire. Highly flammable, but it's only flammable when it mixes with oxygen. So if it's kept away from oxygen, it is inert. And so inside the body of the Zeppelin, there are up to 19 separate gas bags filled with hydrogen. What you needed to do, at the beginning of the war, any machine gun only had solid lead bullets. So they would just make a hole and you'd lose a bit of gas. There, not enough to create such a loss that it would lose height. So the problem they had was trying to work out how can we expose the oxygen in these gas bags to oxygen to make it flammable and then set it on fire. So there was no official plan of doing it. It was individual people, inventors worked on doing it. And the first three who came up with an idea was Mr. Buckingham, Mr. Pomley, and a Mr. Brock, or Lieutenant Brock. Basically, Buckingham's bullet was an incendiary bullet. Pomeroy's bullet was an explosive bullet, and Brock's bullet was a mixture that had qualities of both explosive and incendiary bullets. They all passed their tests to be used, but the organisation in charge felt that none of them guaranteed success. So what they did, the guns were firing this gun from their aeroplanes, which had a circular drum of bullets, was to the idea being that hopefully an explosive bullet would blow a big hole in the gas bag, out, mix with oxygen, become flammable, and a following incendiary bullet would then ignite the gas. That was the plan. And yes, that raid, we've just been talking about the 16 airship raid when the first one was brought down. That was William Leaf Robinson firing those bullets for only the second time they were used, first time successfully. And yeah, he was the pilot who had the victory over a German airship. It was a Schütte-Lanz, but it's yes, that night, and that was a game changer. At that point, everything changes. The whole air war over Britain changes at that point. For the first time, we have an effective weapon that we can use.
That's one other
Outer fabric is linen. Linen, yeah, covered in dope to make it tight, like they use on aeroplane skin. So yeah, it's a lot of it apparently came from Britain originally. Inside the gas bags themselves are slightly more interesting material. It's called gold beater's skin, which is made from cows' intestines, which they discovered was a superb airtight substance. Problem is you needed a lot. You needed about 250,000 dead cows for one Zeppelin, because the 3 layers of this stuff. One cow gives you a square about that big. This is nearly 200 meters long, and that's filled completely with these gas bags. Later on, that was unsustainable, and so they dropped it down to like 1 layer of gold beater skin and then some light silk. No, they would have been very disappointed because there is certainly in conquered countries like Belgium and France, sausages they weren't allowed to make sausages in captured countries. The skins had to be sent back to Germany for the Zeppelin effort. I don't. There's a debate as to whether that happened in Germany as well. I don't believe Germans would give up their sausages. I don't think they would. It's part of the culture. But certainly conquered countries lost their cows.
The Zeppelins of those airships with propellers, and what drove the propellers? Gasoline?
Yes, what they call benzene, yeah, which is it's a type of petrol, yeah.
So I would think they'd need to have a lot of
Yep.
petrol to come.
Yep.
All the way from Germany.
Yep. So weight on a Zeppelin is everything. And before any Zeppelin left Germany, the commander had a sheet, an outline of the Zeppelin, and marks where water containers for ballast were. And he had to weigh everything he put on board. So it depends where he was going. That would dictate how much he felt he needed, plus an extra if things go wrong. So he's got to calculate everything down to the last. Water for ballast, petrol, oil, the weight of the crew, everything goes in the mix, and then how much bombs you can carry, because the amount of gas has left, and you get that balance right. So people often say to me, well, how many men in a Zeppelin crew? That depended as well. If the weight wasn't quite right, he might drop off. I mean, some Zeppelins you see fly with 22 men, others might have 16 on board. and the 16 are just going to have to work a bit harder than the 22.
And were the petrol tanks separated so that if a bullet or whatever, you know, some missiles shot at the Zeppelin broke through one of the tanks of petrol, the other ones would not
Yeah. So
use their petrol?
Zeppelin had 3 engines. The next batch all had 4 engines. Some ended up with 6 engines. Each engine is positioned in the body above it, and it's gravity fed. So the fuel is coming down from down into like, be an engine at the back of this here. Fuel drop coming down. So that engine tank, the engine back, their petrol tanks are there. So literally be directly above where the engine was. It would feed the individual engine.
So it would make sense if you want to bring the airship down, you point at, you fire at the.
What you've got then is a small target, and you know these are not sophisticated aeroplanes going up. Once they crack of explosive and incendiary bullets, that's the target. Go for. You know, unless a searchlight finds you're as a defence pilot, you're flying a patrol line backwards and forwards between bases, waiting to find to Zeppelin and hold it, and if it can't, it disappears in the blackness. In some ways, it's hunting for a needle in a haystack, unless the lights are on it and the lights can hold it. And the perfect situation is one light holds it, and then another one comes, and then they cone it, and it's sitting at the top of the cone, and then planes around can see it, and then they can take off from there, leave their patrol lines, and head towards it, and just hope that the searchlights maintain the hold.
And the airplanes didn't have headlights on them?
No, they didn't have, and they didn't have radios either. So when they went up, they were just on their own, looking until they physically do patrol in the dark. So yeah, it was a tough job. Both sides. You come away with great admiration for the crews of the Zeppelins and what they experienced. You were learning.
If you knew if there was a direct correlation between what was learned from the period of the First World War with the Zeppelins and the other airships to civil defence and air raid precautions in the Second World War, was there a sort of, I know there were preparations pre the Second World War quite a few years before, but have you found anything that has a direct influence?
Yeah. So air raid defences, 1917 in the UK, had developed quite strongly, and actually by the end of the war were incredibly effective. And if you look at a breakdown of the First World defence system, you would see the World War II defence system in it. You've got parts of the country broken into areas. Each area has a section which commands the airfields in its area, the barrage balloons in its area, searchlights in its area, all those things. They answer to one sector control. That sector control takes all those separate bases, then can send out messages all the different fighter stations to say we've got coming direct. The whole system is all telephone controlled. And Ashmore said at the end of the war that by the time a German aircraft was seen, he knew about it. The exact same basis, with the addition of radar, quite helpful. For the Second World War, it's basically a development of that same system. So yeah, they are learning an awful lot during that war, and in many cases, you know, where our air defence system would have been in World War II without World War One, I don't know. Been there to drive it forward. Obviously, after World War One, it went into disrepair. But when they need it again, they said, well, that worked, so let's take that and let's develop that.
1917.
So 1917, that starts. In 1917, in August, you see the start of what they call LADA, London Air Defence Area, with a senior officer in charge, and from then on, then you start things happening and developing. So from 1917 is its building process. It becomes incredibly effective. Yep.
Yes, just one final question. How successful or otherwise are the Ghost bombers?
So, okay, so after the Zeppelin raids, after the Zeppelins have been defeated, Germany switches to heavy bomber. How effective were they? It was a very different situation. As we've just sort of in the talk, singly on their might be the Gothas initially started daylight bombing, whereas all the Zeppelins had been night bombing. Gothas came in daylight and they came in a squadron. So they were on Wednesday morning. So London was fully at work. There had never been an aeroplane raid before. There was no. The sky over London is full of bomber aircraft swirling around, dropping bombs literally over the city of London.
And what year was that?
That first raid was caused most casualties of any of the air raids of the First World War. That first raid, because it was so new and it was broad daylight, they could see what they were bombing. This is a big difference. They can see what they're bombing, and so, but this is to the grindstone, sorted it, made it very, very hard. So they, by September, have been forced to switch to night bombing themselves. So they are then coming over on their own, because they're trying to squad at night because they each other. So they sort of take up 5 intervals and come to London, but they get to London and they bomb there. But we continually build up the defences. There's an interesting thing. That first London Gotha raid in June 19, I think the defences fired something like 340 anti-aircraft shells. By the last raid in May 1918, they fired 30,000 anti-aircraft shells in that raid. So you could see there was a huge improvement in defences. And basically, the brave pilots were the ones who were getting caught out initially. These are the ones, because they're pushing all the way to London, they're the ones who are suffering. As that attrition on the better pilots means you've got new, younger, less experienced pilots coming in. Once they start encountering this huge barrage of fire on the approach London, then just turn around and drop their bombs. Lots of villages in Kent get bombed by the Gothas, because these guys haven't got the courage to go on, because they're just getting shot to pieces. And so they turn and they drop their bombs over Kent and go away. So initially, the different. We had to learn to deal with that. We learned to deal with the Zeppelins. Eventually we got there, and so the last raid on this country was 1918. It was enter November, but there are no more raids on this country after May. So did you want to say?
I was just going to ask, what was the first Zeppelin raid? And also, I remember there was a school in Poplar that got badly bombed. Now, was that by a Zeppelin or was that by a Gotha?
So the school in Poplar was bombed by a Gotha. In that raid was been over, but then heading east to go back to the coast. If they still got bombs, drop them as they go. So it wasn't like a deliberate aim there. They were just releasing bombs, and one, unfortunately, which was really resonated with the British public. Anything that started, affecting children, and the whole of the East End stopped for the funeral, and newspapers had so much coverage of it, and pictures from the funeral and everything. And yeah, that was pretty shocking. That was pretty terrible stuff. Sorry, the first part of your question was?
Yeah, what was the worst then?
So the most damaging Zeppelin raid was on the night of the 8th and 9th of September 1915, when Zeppelin L-13 flew from Bloomsbury to the city and caused £500,000 worth of damage. That's £500,000 worth of damage in 1915. So it's an awful lot more damage. Interestingly, we are within range of a plaque commemorating that raid on Farringdon Road, as you're going back to Farringdon Station. On the right-hand side, you'll see a building called the Zeppelin Building, and there's a plaque at ground level that says this building was totally destroyed in the Zeppelin raid on the 8th and 9th of September 1915 and subsequently rebuilt. And that's on the right-hand side as you're going back to Farringdon Station. And that was that raid. That was the most damaging raid of all raids in the war by far. And that's mainly because it dropped quite a few bombs around the city of London, and there was an area of textile warehouses, and near the Guildhall, absolutely gutted them, and that caused most of the damage.
We've got a couple of questions from home as well, Ian. So the first is, were the crews prepared for cold temperatures, low oxygen levels at altitude?
So initially, we have this situation where shut down, they develop new zones that climb higher and higher, and therefore we get this situation where they are had leather jackets under, fur jackets on top, woolly hats, fur hats, big felt overboots that went over their ordinary shoes, just anything they could to insulate themselves. But yeah, it was horrendous. The guys who had probably the best experience, if you call it a best experience, were the mechanics working on the engines, because at least the engines offer a little bit of heat. But there's no heating on board a Zeppelin whatsoever. They don't have the time. They don't have the weight carrying capacity for that. Fire on the Zeppelin. I always think the worst job on a Zeppelin, right on top of the Zeppelin itself, right on the top of the envelope up there was a machine gun post, and there would be 2 or 3 machine guns, and 2 guys would do 2-hour shifts standing on top of the Zeppelin to look out for enemy aircraft approaching from above. And they would be there, they would literally standing on top with a canvas waist-high screen to protect them from the wind. And that was a brutal positioning, and not to be enjoyed by anyone.
And we have one more question, which is, I'll read it out. 187 Balls Pond Road was an open site until around 1990, until flats were built on it. A PSV driver testing site was there for many years, from the 1970s. Was this the result of the raid? Okay, so 187
Balls Pond Road. In my time, I've only known it as the modern building that's been there. So the fire, the 2 incendiary bombs that hit 187 Balls Pond Road, interior, but I don't think it was damaged that they couldn't rebuild inside. Now, I don't know for certain on this, but quite often a lot of the buildings you see are damaged by fire. It's internal structure that goes, the floorboards, the stairs. So you still, in most cases, the brick. I don't know. Probably did rebuild it. Thomas Sharping, who owned it, was a builder, so I'm sure he would have been quite keen to try and secure that. I don't know. It's I think the question said the 1990s the flats were built.
That's right.
Yeah. I don't know. Might know.
We're in the right place to find out for another day.
Yes, absolutely.
That'd be good. I think if there are no more questions, we might round up, unless there's anyone who wanted to get a question in. No,
No,
well, I
good.
think we can another big round of applause to Ian.
Thank you very much. Thank you.